It was a Tuesday, clear skies. Gentle light. The kind of morning where you might pause on the sidewalk, coffee in hand, and look up just because the towers shimmered so beautifully in the sun. People were rushing as always, subways rumbling below, office lights blinking on. Some were running late. Some kissed their kids goodbye a little too fast, but no one thought it would matter. And then at 8:46 a.m., the sky tore open. A plane. Too low, too fast. Straight into the North Tower. Confusion at first. Then 17 minutes later, a second strike. And suddenly everything shifted. This was no accident. Smoke poured out like something alive. Sirens wailed. The streets filled with people staring upward, frozen. Dust and paper rained down like snow. The news spread faster than the fire. Phones stopped working. Hearts stopped too. And before the towers fell, something else did. A quiet certainty we had always carried. That morning, the world we knew ended, and a new one began. The towers fall. They fell. Not all at once, but floor by floor, window by window, soul by soul. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower gave way. Steel turned to smoke, concrete to dust. People ran, but the cloud ran faster. It moved like a wave, gray, thick, unstoppable. It swallowed streets, swallowed light. And then came the silence. I remember the silence. It was not peace. It was absence, like the world had lost its sound. 29 minutes later, the North Tower followed. And just like that, the skyline changed. A space that once held two giants now held only sky, and a grief too wide to name. There were shoes left in the street, briefcases without owners, a fire helmet lying alone on a pile of rubble. Some ran down stairwells and made it out. Others stayed behind to help. Firefighters climbed upward, knowing. Office workers held hands with strangers. A man carried his colleague down 60 flights. A woman sang softly to keep others calm. There were voices on phone calls, final words whispered from smoke-filled rooms. I love you. Tell the kids I'm proud of them. I'm not going to make it. Those calls played again and again in the hearts of the people who received them. They still do. The buildings fell, but what stayed was the weight. Across the country, televisions flickered in living rooms and waiting rooms, classrooms and corner bars. People cried without knowing why. People held hands without asking names. No one moved much that day. We just watched. We just listened. The sky stayed clear. That was the cruelest part. No rain to wash the dust away. Just a blue so bright it almost hurt. We had no words for what had happened. So we stood in the absence of them and breathed in the ash of what used to be. That morning began with sunlight on glass. It ended with smoke in the lungs of a city. And something in all of us, some innocence, some ease was gone. Not lost, just no longer ours. America pauses. The next day, the country did not wake up. It just opened its eyes, slowly, painfully, and realized it was not dreaming. Flights were grounded, highways empty, Broadway went dark, stadiums silent. For the first time in living memory, the United States paused, not out of choice, but out of something deeper, a stillness rooted in shock. Flags appeared overnight, on porches, in store windows, on overpasses and street corners. People hung them not out of pride exactly, but out of need. A way to say we are still here. A way to hold each other in a time when hugs felt too few. In towns big and small, candlelight vigils lit up the darkness. People gathered not to speak, but just to be near each other. Strangers stood shoulder to shoulder in parks, in churches, in parking lots. Some prayed, some wept. Some simply stared into the flame and wondered how the world had changed so quickly. And it had changed. Everywhere you went, The air felt different. Planes were missing from the sky, and their absence was loud. A single backpack left on a bench could clear a whole block. Eyes scanned, hearts raced, and yet, somehow people were kinder, slower, gentler with one another. I remember hearing less noise that week, fewer horns, fewer arguments, as if we were all speaking more softly out of respect for the dead, for the grieving, for the uncertainty. Children asked questions their parents could not answer. Why would someone do this? Are we safe now? Will it happen again? And sometimes the only honest reply was a quiet hug or a whispered, I don't know. The news did not stop. Photos, names, footage, so many names, so many faces. The missing were everywhere, posted on walls, stapled to lampposts, carried in pockets. Each flyer was a life, a story, a person, someone still hoped to find. And still the smoke kept rising. In the days after Congress stood together and sang, God Bless America, members of both parties, shoulder-to-shoulder voices cracking, unsure of the tune, but sure of the moment. We were not united in politics. We were not united in plans. But for a while, we were united in grief. The world had not ended, but it had shifted. And for the first time in a long time, America was looking inward, holding its breath, holding its people close. Because when there are no answers, sometimes all you can do is pause and listen for what remains. Hay called it Ground Zero, not a name anyone had planned. It came from the language of bombs, of impact points, of places where everything changes. And now, right in the heart of Lower Manhattan, there it was, a smoking wound where the towers had once stood. The pile. That is what the workers called it. Not out of coldness, but out of truth. What remained of the buildings was no longer buildings. It was steel twisted like ribbon, dust inches deep, shoes, paper, bits of glass that had once been windows, bits of lives that had once been whole. In the early days, they came with buckets, with gloves, with masks that did not do enough. Firefighters, police officers, iron workers, paramedics, volunteers from all over the country. They dug with bare hands, past debris in lines, searching for survivors, and then simply for remains. There was hope for a time. Dogs barked at hollow spaces. Microphones lowered into the rubble caught distant tapping. People held their breath. But the tapping never grew louder. The voices never came back. Still, they searched. They worked day and night, in heat and rain, through smoke and silence. They did not ask when it would end, only what more they could do. Some brought food. Some brought water. One woman stood outside the site every day, with a sign that read, "Thank you." She never left until night fell. The smell lingered. Acrid, metallic, unforgettable. It clung to clothes, to skin, to memory. For months you could catch it on the wind if you were anywhere near Lower Manhattan. And above it all, the dust settled, slowly coating everything in a soft gray. A quiet kind of grief. Families gathered behind barriers, holding photos, calling names. Some refused to leave until they had word. Any word. There were stories. A firefighter found his brother's helmet. A wedding ring was pulled from the ash and returned to a wife who had not stopped waiting. A Bible page burnt at the edges was found open to words about forgiveness. It became sacred ground, not just because of the loss, but because of the love poured into it afterward. The sweat, the tears, the silence shared between strangers. And in that space where two towers once stood, something else began to rise. Not a building, not yet, but a promise that they would not be forgotten, that we would carry their names, that in this place of ending, something enduring would take root, because some scars should not fade. and some places should always be remembered. Ground Zero. They called it Ground Zero, not a name anyone had planned. It came from the language of bombs, of impact points, of places where everything changes. And now, right in the heart of Lower Manhattan, there it was a smoking wound where the towers had once stood. The pile. That is what the workers called it, not out of coldness, but out of truth. What remained of the buildings was no longer buildings. It was steel twisted like ribbon, dust inches deep, shoes, paper, bits of glass that had once been windows, bits of lives that had once been whole. In the early days they came with buckets, with gloves, with masks that did not do enough. Firefighters, police officers, iron workers, paramedics, volunteers from all over the country. They dug with bare hands, past debris in lines, searching for survivors, and then simply for remains. There was hope for a time. Dogs barked at hollow spaces. Microphones lowered into the rubble caught distant tapping. People held their breath, but the tapping never grew louder. The voices never came back. Still they searched. They worked day and night in heat and rain, through smoke and silence. They did not ask when it would end, only what more they could do. Some brought food, some brought water. One woman stood outside the site every day with a sign that read, "Thank you." She never left until night fell. The smell lingered, acrid, metallic, unforgettable. It clung to clothes, to skin, to memory. For months, you could catch it on the wind if you were anywhere near Lower Manhattan. And above it all, the dust settled, slowly coating everything in a soft gray. A quiet kind of grief. Families gathered behind barriers, holding photos, calling names. Some refused to leave until they had word. Any word. There were stories. A firefighter found his brother's helmet. A wedding ring was pulled from the ash and returned to a wife who had not stopped waiting. A Bible page burnt at the edges was found open to words about forgiveness. It became sacred ground, not just because of the loss, but because of the love poured into it afterward. The sweat, the tears, the silence shared between strangers. And in that space where two towers once stood, something else began to rise. Not a building, not yet, but a promise. That they would not be forgotten. That we would carry their names. That in this place of ending, something enduring would take root. Because some scars should not fade, and some places should always be remembered. The President speaks. He stood on a pile of rubble surrounded by broken steel and ash, one hand on a retired firefighter's shoulder, the other holding a bullhorn. The crowd pressed close. Rescue workers, first responders, people who had been digging through the ruins for days without sleep. And then George W. Bush spoke. At first his voice was quiet, almost lost in the wind. But someone shouted, "We can't hear you." And he answered, his voice, rising clear, firm, "I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon." There was no script, no teleprompter, just a moment raw and unfiltered. It struck something deep in those who were there and in those watching from homes all across the country. People who were angry, people who were scared, people who did not yet know what to feel. But in that moment, they knew one thing: they were not alone. The President's words echoed through radios and living rooms, through firehouses and church basements. Not poetry, not policy, just certainty. That this would not be forgotten. That someone would answer for it. The next night, he stood before Congress. Behind him, the chamber was filled not only with senators and representatives, but with generals, cabinet members, guests with red eyes and folded flags. The room was heavy with silence. He spoke of sorrow, of resolve, of enemies hiding in shadows. He named Al-Qaeda. He named Osama bin Laden. He promised justice, not vengeance, but justice. And then he said, what many had already felt, our grief has turned to anger and anger to resolution. The words were met with standing ovations, with applause that felt more like thunder than ceremony. It was not a moment for division. Not yet. In those first days, the country wanted a voice, a direction, and George W. Bush gave them both. His approval ratings soared. Flags multiplied. Country music stations played anthems that hadn't existed a week earlier. In barbershops and schoolyards, people spoke not of party, but of purpose. But behind the speeches, behind the certainty, were questions not yet asked. Questions about war, about liberty, about the shape of the world that would come next. No one knew those answers yet. But that September, what people needed was a voice that did not tremble. And that week their president stood firm on a pile of ash and memory and said to the world, we will not go quietly. We will not forget. We will not stand still. Fear and resolve. In the weeks after the towers fell, the country lived in two worlds at once. One was made of flags and kindness, strangers helping strangers, blood donation lines wrapping around blocks, meals left on doorsteps, a neighbor checking in when they never had before. There was unity real and rare, the kind born not of agreement, but of shared heartbreak. The other world was made of fear. White powder in envelopes, rumors of bombs in backpacks, news tickers that never stopped scrolling. Every day seemed to bring something new, a suspicious package, a grounded flight, a fresh list of targets. We watched the skies, the subways, the faces of fellow passengers, and we waited. The word terror became part of daily speech. Schools ran lockdown drills. Public buildings installed metal detectors. For the first time, we understood how small an open society could feel when its doors began to close. Airports changed almost overnight. Shoes off, belts off, bottles banned. Families said goodbye at the curb. Soldiers with rifles walked terminal halls. Travel, once a thing of leisure, became an act of trust and of tension. People began to look at one another differently. Some wore flags on their jackets. Others wore fear in their eyes. And some, especially those who wore hijabs or had brown skin, suddenly found themselves seen as suspects instead of neighbors. There were incidents, ugly ones. A Sikh man in Arizona was murdered by someone who thought he looked like one of them. Mosques received threats. Some children were pulled out of school by frightened parents. The enemy, once a distant name, had begun to blur too often, mistaken for anyone who looked unfamiliar. But there was resolve, too, stronger than the fear, clearer. Communities gathered not to tear apart, but to hold together. Interfaith vigils, neighborhood walks, clergy and cops and cab drivers, standing shoulder to shoulder saying, "This is not who we are." And through it all, the question hung in the air. How do we protect what we love without losing what we are? In Washington, new powers were granted. Surveillance expanded, wiretaps approved. The Patriot Act was passed in a rush, pages unread, by some who voted. Security tightened. Liberty was measured against safety, and the balance would never quite return to where it had been. But in homes, in hearts, people did what they always do. They adjusted, they prayed, they prepared, and each morning they kept moving forward, eyes open, hands steadied, hearts carrying both the fear of what might come and the quiet courage to face it. Afghanistan. The first front. The war began in the dark. On October 7, 2001, less than a month after the towers fell, America struck back. The first bombs fell over Afghanistan. The target Al-Qaeda and the Taliban regime that sheltered them. Half a world away, the sound of jet engines sliced through the silence of desert nights. Cruise missiles lit up the mountains. U.S. forces joined with Afghan rebels on the ground. The mission was swift, clear, and full of resolve, dismantle terror at its root. At home, the news came in clips, grainy footage of explosions, maps with blinking red dots, reports from dusty airstrips. A nation still reeling from grief now turned its eyes east toward a land few had thought of before. Afghanistan, rugged, ancient, complicated. A place shaped by centuries of invaders and empires. Now it would carry a new name in American memory, the first battlefield of the war on terror. The Taliban fell quickly, faster than anyone expected. City after city changed hands. Girls returned to school in places where they had once been banned. Music returned to radios. Men shaved beards they had once been forced to grow. On camera, it looked like freedom was blooming. But the war was not over. Not even close. Bin Laden was not found. His lieutenants melted into caves and borderlands. The Taliban faded into shadows, not gone, just waiting. American troops built bases, ran patrols, made contact with villagers who spoke in Pashto and Dari, and wary glances. Marines helped dig wells. Medics handed out supplies. Some children smiled at the soldiers. Others stared unblinking. Back home, flags still flew. Soldiers were welcomed at airports with applause and signs. They were heroes, and rightly so. But quietly, a new rhythm took hold. Deploy, return. Deploy, again. I remember talking to a mother whose son had just shipped out. She folded his laundry for days after he left, as if keeping his room perfect might bring him back faster. She watched the news every night, volume low, hands clasped, waiting. There was pride, but there was also something else, a sense that this war might not be like the others, that the enemy did not wear a uniform, that there might not be a finish line. Still, the country stood behind it. After what had happened on 9/11, few questioned the need. Afghanistan was where it started, where the pain first turned outward, where the boots first hit the sand. It was the first answer America gave to terror, but it would not be the last. The hunt for bin Laden. His face was everywhere, on wanted posters in news broadcasts in the quiet corners of American conversation. Osama bin Laden. The name spoken with anger, with fear, with disbelief. How could one man hiding in the mountains bring a superpower to its knees? And yet for years after 9/11, that was the question we kept asking. The hunt for him began immediately. Intelligence poured in. Satellites scanned cave networks. Special forces moved through valleys and over peaks. The Tora Bora Mountains, jagged and ancient, became a name we all suddenly knew. That's where they thought he was in December 2001. Trapped, cornered. But then, nothing. He slipped away. Some said into Pakistan. Others said deeper into the mountains. Wherever he went, he vanished like a ghost swallowed by the land. And the search grew harder. The war in Afghanistan continued, but the trail went cold. New leads came and went. A courier here, a whispered sighting there. Bin Laden became less a man and more a shadow, the symbol of all that had been lost and all that still had not been made right. Presidents changed, priorities shifted, but the name remained. For the soldiers still on the ground, the mission widened, rebuilding, defending, surviving. But for those deep inside the intelligence community, the original question never faded. Where is he? I remember how people spoke of him. With rage, yes, but also with obsession. He had not just hurt America, he had humiliated it, and the country could not rest while he still drew breath. So the work continued in silence behind closed doors, across oceans and languages. Analysts combed through intercepted calls, watched for patterns, followed whispers. Years passed, and still nothing confirmed. But then, in the late 2000s, something shifted. A courier was found, a name, a car, a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. Tall walls, no phone lines, no internet. Something felt off. They watched it for months. Every movement, every shadow behind the curtains. And then came the question no one wanted to ask out loud. Is it him President Obama gave the order on a spring day in 2011? A Navy SEAL team flew in under the cover of night. No lights, no fanfare. They moved quickly, precisely. One helicopter crashed. The others held position. 40 minutes later, it was over. The man who had haunted the world for a decade was dead, shot in a room at the end of a narrow hallway. No trial, no speech, just an ending. Back home, crowds gathered. Some cheered, some cried. Some stood in silence, not knowing exactly how to feel, because it did not bring back what had been lost. It did not undo the grief, but it did close a chapter. One long, painful chapter. The hunt was over, but the war was not. Homeland Security. Before 9/11, most people barely thought about national security. A plane ticket meant paper and a smile. A trip to the Capitol meant you could walk right up the steps. Freedom felt ordinary. But after the towers fell, everything changed. And with that change came something vast, invisible, and permanent. The Department of Homeland Security. It was created less than a year after the attacks, an entire cabinet-level department, born from the ashes. It absorbed 22 agencies overnight, from the Coast Guard to FEMA to the Secret Service. Its mission: protect the country. From anything. From everything. You could feel its presence even if you did not know its name. At airports, shoes came off. Belts, jackets, laptops, all in plastic bins. Passengers scanned, luggage swabbed. Families waved goodbye from behind rope lines instead of the gate. And in other places, too. Subway stations, football games, parades, you saw the shift. More cameras, more searches, more announcements telling you what to do if something looked off. Terror alerts became part of daily life. Color codes, yellow, orange, red, flashed on screens, posted near escalators and entrance halls. Heightened risk, severe threat. No one was quite sure what each level meant, but they felt heavy, just the same. Then came the Patriot Act, passed quickly, overwhelmingly, in the days when fear still gripped the nation. It gave the government broad new powers to surveil, to detain, to monitor phone calls and emails. For many it felt necessary, for others dangerous. The line between protection and privacy blurred, and it has never fully sharpened since. There were stories. A family stopped at the border because their last name matched someone on a list. A library questioned about who checked out which books. Whispers of phone calls flagged, of watch lists built in silence. Still, the vast majority of Americans carried on, not because they stopped caring, but because they were tired. Tired of fear. Tired of the question, is this who we are now? And yet there was another truth. We were safer. Attacks were stopped, plots uncovered, airports hardened. Agencies began talking to one another in ways they had not before. First responders trained together. Information moved faster. Systems once tangled in bureaucracy began to respond with speed. But all of it came at a cost. A sense of ease. A sense of trust. The quiet confidence that your footsteps were yours alone and not traced through a database. Children grew up never knowing an airport without metal detectors. Teenagers grew up with active shooter drills and emergency text alerts. We got used to it. That is what humans do. But somewhere deep down, we still remembered what it felt like before. And some part of us, even now, still wonders if that world will ever return. The war on terror had not just changed foreign policy. It had redrawn the map of home. The axis of evil. On a cold January night in 2002, President George W. Bush stood before Congress to deliver his State of the Union address. The chamber was still dressed in the language of mourning flags pinned to lapels, black ribbons on coats. The grief of 9/11 had not faded. It had settled. And then, in the middle of his speech, the president spoke 3 words that would ripple across the globe: axis of evil. He named 3 countries, Iran, Iraq, and North Korea, and cast them not as isolated threats, but as a united front. A new kind of enemy born not of alliances, but of ideology. Countries that, in his words, seek weapons of mass destruction and pose a grave and growing danger. It was bold, stark, and to many ears chilling. The phrase evoked history. It echoed the Axis powers of World War II, Germany, Italy, Japan. The words were meant to stir something deep in the American memory. The idea of good versus evil, of a just war, waiting just over the horizon. And in the wake of 9/11, many were ready to believe it. The war in Afghanistan was still young. The hunt for bin Laden continued. But attention was already shifting to Iraq and to its leader, Saddam Hussein. He had long been a thorn in America's side, a brutal dictator, a man known for using chemical weapons, for imprisoning dissenters, for threatening his neighbors. Now suddenly, he was spoken of, not just as a tyrant, but as a terrorist in waiting. The administration pointed to intelligent satellite images, intercepted messages, whispered reports from defectors. They spoke of weapons of mass destruction, hidden underground, of secret labs, of mushroom clouds if we waited too long. It was not just about Iraq, they said. It was about the world America now lived in, a world where danger could come from anywhere at any time, where hesitation could mean horror. Many believed them, others did not. Voices of dissent rose in Congress, in editorials, in streets around the world. But in those early months, the drumbeat was steady. The lines were being drawn not just on maps, but in minds. You were with us or against us. And once those words had been spoken, axis of evil, it was hard to imagine any path forward that did not lead to war. Looking back now, it is easy to question, easy to point to what was missed, misunderstood, or manufactured. But in that moment, fear still lingered in our lungs. And fear is a powerful wind. It can move a country, it can blur the truth, and it can lead even a wounded nation, still on its knees, to rise and reach for the sword. March to Iraq. By early 2003, the path to war was no longer a question. It was a countdown. The drums had been beating for months. Every speech, every headline, every intelligence report seemed to march in the same direction, toward Baghdad. Saddam Hussein was back in the center of American attention, not because of something he had done, but because of what he might do. The fear was not of what was, but of what could be: weapons, hidden alliances, formed threats unspoken. The phrase "weapons of mass destruction" became part of the national rhythm. It was repeated with a certainty that blurred the line between warning and belief. Chemical, biological, nuclear words that once belonged to distant Cold War anxiety now sat at kitchen tables. The Bush administration made its case. Iraq had violated UN resolutions. Saddam had defied inspectors. He had used gas on his own people. He supported terrorists. If we waited, they warned we might wait too long. Not everyone was convinced. Weapons inspectors returned to Iraq. They searched palaces, factories, bunkers. They asked for time. They found nothing conclusive. Some pleaded for more patience, but the momentum had taken over. In Washington, Congress debated and gave approval. The president addressed the nation. Coalition partners signed on. Troops were already mobilizing. Equipment lined up in the Kuwaiti desert. The air grew thick with anticipation. Across the country, Americans watched with unease. Some supported the mission, others protested. In cities across the globe, millions marched in opposition. It was the largest coordinated anti-war movement in modern history. But the decision had been made. I remember watching the news that week. Soldiers loading into helicopters, Marines writing letters home, a father in uniform kneeling beside his daughter, whispering something only she would remember. You could feel it coming. Not in shock waves like 9/11, but in footsteps, deliberate, heavy. And then on March 19, 2003, the sky over Baghdad lit up. Shock and awe, they called it. But before the bombs, there was a warning. President Bush spoke directly to Saddam Hussein, "Leave now or face the consequences." There was no reply. So the war began. Cruise missiles struck command centers, airstrips, communication hubs. American tanks crossed the border. Reporters embedded with troops sent dispatches in real time. The invasion was fast, forceful, measured in miles per hour. Within weeks, Saddam's regime crumbled. Statues fell. His palaces were overrun. His face, once plastered on every wall, disappeared under layers of dust and spray paint. But amid the celebration, a question lingered. Where were the weapons they would search for years? Through bunkers, warehouses, hidden caches, and they would find nothing. No WMDs, no secret labs, just rumors, assumptions, pieces of a puzzle that had never fully fit together. But by the time the truth became clear, the war was already well underway. And America once again had crossed an ocean, carrying both its fears and its flag into the heart of uncertainty. Shock and awe. The first night lit up like daylight. Baghdad's sky, usually dark and quiet, pulsed with fire. Missiles streaked overhead. Buildings trembled. And far below, families huddled in bathrooms in basements, covering their children's ears as the windows shook. They called it shock and awe. A strategy meant to overwhelm, to paralyze, to send a message not just to Saddam Hussein, but to the world the United States had come, and it had come decisively. From the Persian Gulf, ships launched cruise missiles by the dozens. From the air, stealth bombers rained precision strikes on command posts, air defenses, government buildings. On television, it looked surgical, distant, almost unreal. I remember watching it unfold on glowing screens in living rooms, in bars, in waiting rooms where no one spoke. The anchors talked in clipped voices over maps and feeds and breaking banners. This is it. And in the background, the skyline of Baghdad, lit with orange flashes. Within days, American and coalition forces advanced swiftly. Towns fell. Resistance scattered. There were flags raised and thumbs up from crowds, cheering children, flowers in the street. At least that is what the early cameras showed. But war is never only what fits into a broadcast. In some places, people waved. In others, they wept. Looting began almost immediately. Museums, libraries, even hospitals stripped bare. Order collapsed faster than anyone had prepared for. There were not enough troops, not enough interpreters, not enough plans for after. And then there were the casualties. Civilians caught in crossfire, markets hit by mistake, convoys lost in confusion, soldiers wounded by enemy fire or friendly fire. Lives changed in a flash and gone just as quickly. Baghdad fell by early April. The regime crumbled. Saddam vanished into hiding. His face, once cold and confident, now flickered on wanted posters. Mission accomplished. The banner read weeks later as President Bush stood aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln flight suit, zipped speaking of victory. But the war was not over, not even close. Insurgencies began to stir. Militias formed from old loyalties, old wounds, new anger. Weapons stockpiles disappeared into the hands of the unknown. Roads became deadly. Each day the line between friend and foe blurred. The war had changed shape fast, without warning. And beneath all the smoke and symbols, something deeper began to sink in. You can destroy a regime in weeks. But rebuilding a nation, that takes years. And sometimes it takes more than even time can give. The Long War. The war did not end when the statue fell. It began again, quieter, harder, more uncertain. At first there were parades, smiles, soldiers waving from Humvees. The headlines said the mission had been accomplished. But beneath the surface, something else was growing. Something no banner could quiet. The explosions came slowly then, suddenly. Improvised explosive devices, IEDs, homemade bombs buried in roads, hidden in trash piles, disguised in dead animals. They were crude, but devastating. A convoy would roll past, and in an instant smoke, flame, silence. Limbs, dust, screams. A patrol route on Tuesday might not be safe on Wednesday, and every alley became a question mark. Insurgents came from everywhere. Former regime loyalists, local militias, foreign fighters slipping in through porous borders. They blended with civilians. They struck, disappeared, struck again. It was not a battlefield. It was a maze. Troops rotated in and out. 1 year home, 1 year back. Some came once. Some came 3, 4, 5 times. They learned to sleep lightly, to read villages like maps, to nod at children and keep one finger near the trigger. There were firefights, raids, hours of boredom broken by seconds of chaos, and always the waiting. At home, yellow ribbons hung on trees, blue stars in windows, families counting down days, lighting candles, reading every email like scripture. Some stopped watching the news. Others could not look away. We were told it would be quick. Then we were told it would take time. Then we stopped being told anything at all. And still, they stayed. Medics, engineers, linguists, riflemen. They built schools, guarded polling places, shared candy with children and stories with elders. They did what they were asked, and more. But the mission kept changing. First it was weapons of mass destruction. Then it was regime change. Then it was counterinsurgency. Then it was nation building. The goalposts moved, and the war stretched on. Some began to wonder if the war itself had become the mission. Meanwhile, the toll mounted, not just in bodies but in minds. Trauma came home in silence, in sleepless nights, in short tempers, in quiet tears behind closed doors. Friends lost to suicide, marriages strained, memories that would not let go. The country supported the troops. Almost everyone said so, but fewer and fewer seemed to understand what the war really was, what it felt like, what it cost. And those who knew, they stopped talking about it, not out of shame, but out of exhaustion. Because when a war goes long enough, it stops being a story. It becomes a background noise. But for the ones who lived it, for the ones who still live with it, it never fades. It stays, in muscle, in memory, in every calendar date circled with quiet hope that maybe this year it will finally end. Abu Ghraib and the Shadows. The photos were grainy, dim, almost surreal, but what they showed could not be blurred. American soldiers, Iraqi prisoners, leashes, hoods, naked bodies stacked like furniture, a smile here, a thumbs up there, and beneath it all, a terrible silence. The images came out in 2004, leaked from a prison west of Baghdad, Abu Ghraib. once used by Saddam Hussein for torture and execution, now under U.S. control. And what happened inside its walls shook the very soul of a nation already weary from war. The story was not just about a few soldiers. It was about what happens in the fog of war behind closed doors when fear and power meet without oversight. Detainees held without trial, beaten, degraded, some never charged, some never left. The response was swift condemnation, investigation court-martials. Names were named, apologies made. A few low-ranking guards went to prison. But the questions ran deeper. How high did the orders go? Was this an isolated failure or a symptom of something larger? The world watched. Allies recoiled. Enemies rejoiced. For a war that had once claimed the mantle of freedom, the moral ground cracked. I remember the faces of people I knew, veterans, patriots, quiet citizens, who had supported the mission from the start. They looked at those photographs and looked away, not from denial, but from heartbreak. Because no matter how just, the cause war corrodes, not just buildings and bodies, but values. And this war, like all wars, had found its shadows. There were other names too. Guantanamo, rendition, black sites, places where rules bent, blurred, disappeared. The word enhanced interrogation entered the national vocabulary, a phrase that tried to hide what it really meant. And back home, the debate deepened. Can a nation fight terror without losing its reflection? Some said these were necessary measures. Others called them betrayals. But everyone, whether they admitted it or not, felt something shift. Because it is easy to point to villains across the sea. Harder to face what happens in your own uniform, under your own flag. The story of Abu Ghraib did not end the war, but it changed it, not in strategy, in spirit. A mirror had been held up, and for a moment, just long enough, we saw not who we meant to be, but who we had become. Voices from home. The war may have been fought far away, but its weight was carried quietly at home. In cul-de-sacs and cornfields, on city blocks and dusty country roads, families watched the calendar like it held its breath. Deployments, homecomings, deployments again. A rhythm that wrapped around birthdays, graduations, empty chairs at Thanksgiving. There were blue stars in windows, symbols of someone serving, and sometimes gold ones too, the kind no one ever wants to hang. Spouses became single parents. Children learned to trace their parents' face with fingers over photographs. Some sent letters every week covered in crayon drawings, stickers, shaky handwriting that just said, "Come home." Phone calls came at odd hours, choppy, brief. "Hi, I'm okay. Tell Mom I love her. I can't say where I am." And then silence again, until the next chance to speak. I remember a woman from Ohio. Her husband had deployed 3 times. She kept his boots by the door, never moved them. She said it helped the kids pretend he'd just stepped out for a bit. At churches, people formed prayer circles. At schools, teachers explained why their students cried during the pledge. Some towns organized care packages, socks, snacks, soap letters from strangers tucked between them. But it was not just waiting. It was worry. The kind that never quite leaves your chest. Every knock at the door. Every unfamiliar car parked on the street. Every time the news mentioned a casualty in an unspecified province. And when the worst did come, it came quietly. 2 officers in uniform. A folded flag. A photo placed on a mantle that would never be updated again. Some families became advocates. Some retreated into silence. Some marriages held. Some didn't. And for those who came home physically, at least there were new battles. PTSD, injury, memory, trying to explain what it was like and watching people nod kindly, but not understand, because how could they? The war had lasted so long it became background noise for many, a flicker on the news, a statistic. But for the families who lived it, who still live with it was never distant. It was a seat left open at dinner, a voice missing in the family group chat, a child old enough now to ask, "Why did Daddy have to go?" The answers are never simple, but what remains is this. Behind every mission, behind every uniform, there was a kitchen light left on, a name whispered at bedtime, and a promise, spoken or not, that someone would be waiting. The surge and the cost. By 2006, the war in Iraq had unraveled. Sectarian violence tore through neighborhoods. Sunni and Shia militias clashed in the streets. Bombings became daily. Baghdad was on edge, and so were the troops patrolling streets, where friend and enemy looked the same, never sure what waited around the next corner. The strategy wasn't working. So, in early 2007, a new plan was announced, the surge. An additional 30,000 troops sent, not just to fight, but to stabilize, to live among Iraqis, to protect civilians, to hold ground and build trust. General David Petraeus led it. The idea wasn't just more boots on the ground, it was boots with purpose. Clear hold build. That was the new rhythm. The shift was risky. It meant more deployments, more strain, more danger. But for a time, it worked. Violence dropped. Markets reopened. Local leaders re-emerged. In some neighborhoods, kids began playing outside again. Walls were still covered in scars, but there were fewer funerals. It felt for a moment like maybe, just maybe, progress had come. But progress had a cost. More troops meant more targets, more IEDs, more young men and women who didn't come home. Hospitals back in the States filled with the wounded, not all visible. Burn pits, poisoned lungs. Concussions, scrambled memory. The term traumatic brain injury became more common. So did prosthetic limbs. So did silence. Families adjusted because they had to. Ramps were installed. Medications managed. Marriages tested. And for some, the wounds inside never fully healed. Public opinion began to shift. Support for the war that had once been nearly unanimous was now deeply divided. Some still believed in the mission. Others asked hard questions. Why did we go? What did we win? What did we lose? I remember hearing a soldier speak at a small-town gathering. He said, "I don't care about the politics. All I know is the man next to me needed me, and I showed up." He wasn't angry. He was tired. By 2008, the surge had wound down. Violence had decreased. Some troops came home. But the war had changed shape again. More advisory, more shadowed, more uncertain. The fighting hadn't stopped. It had just gone quiet. And yet the cost kept growing. Not just in dollars, though there were billions spent, but in birthdays missed, in night terrors, in names etched into black stone. The surge was in some ways a turning point. But for the ones who bore its weight, it was not a strategy. It was another chapter in a war that seemed to have forgotten how to end. Bin Laden's end. It happened on a Sunday night, May 1st, 2011, the kind of evening where most Americans were winding down, brushing teeth, folding laundry, watching baseball. Nothing remarkable, nothing expected. And then the news broke. Osama bin Laden is dead. For a moment, the whole country paused, not in fear this time, but in disbelief. After nearly 10 years of war, of searching, of grief, stretched thin, he was gone. The man who had haunted America since that clear morning in September. The face behind the smoke. The voice in those grainy videos. The name whispered in anger and whispered in prayer. He had been found not in a cave, but in a compound, in Abbottabad, Pakistan. High walls, barbed wire, just a few miles from a military academy, hidden in plain sight. The operation was quiet, precise, carried out by SEAL Team 6 under the cover of night. 2 helicopters flew in. One crashed, but no one backed out. They cleared the rooms one by one, and in the final hallway, they found him. A brief moment, a single shot. And then it was done. President Obama appeared on TV that night. His words calm, measured: justice has been done. Outside, the White House crowds gathered. Flags waved. People sang. In Times Square, strangers embraced. Some cried. Some cheered. Some stood with their hands over their hearts. It was not joy exactly. It was something else. A weight lifted, a wound acknowledged. Not healed, but marked. Because this was never just about one man. Bin Laden was the beginning, but the war had stretched long beyond him. Still, his death felt like a door closing, and some part of the country, exhausted, conflicted, finally exhaled. I remember someone saying, "Maybe now we can move on." But even as the words were spoken, we all knew better. There was no rewind, no going back to before. Bin Laden's end was not the end of the war on terror. It was a page turned, a chapter closed, but the book was still being written. After the kill, he was gone. The man who had changed the course of a century, killed in the dark, buried at sea. No trial, no last statement, just silence. And in that silence, the country asked a quiet, complicated question. Now what? For a moment, there was unity again. A breath of clarity. Flags flew at half-staff. News anchors spoke in tones they had not used in years. Justice, they said. Closure. But behind those words, the lines were already beginning to blur. Because the death of Osama bin Laden did not end the war. It did not bring back the towers. It did not ease the grief in Gold Star homes. It did not erase the scars etched into the minds of those who had fought. The war in Afghanistan continued. So did the mission in Iraq, though it was changing. So did drone strikes in Yemen, Pakistan, Somalia wars, without borders, broadcast without headlines. Some wondered if the fight was still about 9/11 at all, or if the war had grown into something else, something wider, harder to define, harder to end. At home, the news cycle moved fast. Within days, the victory began to fade into politics, into questions. How long had Pakistan known? Was the intelligence gathered legally? Could the mission have been handled differently? And in those questions, something deeper. Did it change anything at all? The faces of the fallen were still on mantelpieces. The boots were still by the door. The welcome home hugs were still followed by long nights, quiet stares, unspoken thoughts. For some, bin Laden's death was a kind of justice. For others, it was just a moment, a needed one, but brief. I remember a veteran saying, "I thought I'd feel more." He paused. Then I realized, this isn't a movie. There's no ending music. Just, what's next? Because by 2011, a generation had grown up under the shadow of 9/11. Some had no memory of that morning, only the war it left behind. And so, the mission shifted, the focus scattered, but the question lingered. If the man who started it all is gone, why are we still at war? There were no easy answers. There never had been. Only the slow turning of history, and the quiet understanding that even justice leaves echoes. The Withdrawal. By the time America began to leave Afghanistan, 20 years had passed. 2 decades of soldiers rotating in and out, of classrooms built and bombed, of hopes raised and too often dashed. And then, in April 2021, the announcement came. It is time to end America's longest war. President Joe Biden set the deadline. Troops would be home by September 11th, a full circle, a bookend. That was the hope. But wars do not end with deadlines. As U.S. forces pulled back, the Taliban surged forward. City after city fell, sometimes in days, sometimes in hours. The Afghan military, built with years of training and billions in aid, collapsed faster than anyone could explain. And by August, they were at the gates of Kabul. I remember watching it unfold. The airport swarmed, families climbing fences, mothers handing babies to strangers. Desperation not in words, but in motion. Planes overloaded, a boy clinging to the wheel well, a nation unraveling in real time. Inside the gates, U.S. troops worked around the clock, processing visas, guarding runways, holding the line. Outside chaos, inside heartbreak. Then came the explosion. A suicide bomber at Abbey Gate. 13 American service members lost. Over 170 Afghan civilians gone in an instant. It was one of the deadliest days of the war, and it came at the very end. The last plane lifted off on August 30th, 2021. No ceremony, no speeches, just a dark runway and the closing of a door. The war was over, but not everyone made it out. Thousands were left behind, interpreters, allies, women who had taught girls to read, journalists who had told too much truth. Some hid, some ran, some still wait. At home, the withdrawal sparked grief and anger and exhaustion. Some asked why we stayed so long. Others asked why we left the way we did. And many just sat in silence. Because it was not just a war that ended. It was 20 years of memory, of sacrifice, of stories too big to be boxed into a single headline. The war began with smoke in the sky. It ended with dust on the runway. And somewhere between those two images, between September 11, 2001 and August 30, 2021, an entire chapter of American life was written. Not cleanly, not perfectly, but with courage and confusion and consequence. We left. But we did not leave untouched. Good night, America. We were changed, not just by the planes or the towers or the wars, but by the weight of it all. The years, the loss, the choices. 20 years. A generation raised beneath the shadow of 9/11. Some children grew up with a folded flag where a parent should have been. Some came home with scars no one could see. Some never came home at all. And yet through it all, we kept going. We taught, we built, we mourned, we questioned, we served, we argued about the war, we voted on it, we turned away from it. But it never truly left us. It lingered in the background of every airport line, every news alert, every child learning about a day before they were born. It whispered in the lives of Afghans left behind, in the hands of medics, in the boots of Marines, in the silence that sometimes fell when someone asked, "Where were you that morning?" Because we remembered, not just the fire and ash, but the light that came after. The strangers holding hands on bridges, the letters sent to soldiers from second-grade classrooms, the candles that flickered on quiet porches. We do not always agree on what it meant or how it ended, but we can agree on this. We lived it, together. And for those we lost, for those who served and waited and worried and wept, we remember. Not just in monuments or memorials, but in memory itself. So tonight, I say this to you. If your heart still holds the weight of those years, if your story was shaped by it in ways big or small, you are not alone. History does not always offer peace, but it offers perspective and a kind of quiet truth. The story of 9/11 and the war on terror is not just about war. It is about who we were, who we tried to be, and who we still hope we are. So rest now. We have carried enough. Good night, America. You are remembered. You are loved. You are home.